Hello, everyone. Welcome. Philip Beere from the No Line podcast and Thailand Casino Insider. Seated today with Vitaly Umansky from Seaport Partners. And Vitaly, great to see you. Last time we talked was in Macau at G2E.
Yep.
And here we are at the Thailand Casino Summit. Very early event for what's soon to be planned, a casino resort in Thailand, possibly. We're hearing a lot of optimism at the event, but you're having a presentation here where you're also bringing up reasons to be, how would you say, not skeptical, but maybe a little bit more bearish versus bullish about whether or not the Thailand casino is going to happen or some factors that should be considered. Before we dive into it, can you explain a little bit about your role at Seaport and also a little bit about your background for those that are not familiar with you?
Yeah, sure. I'm an investment research analyst, so we provide recommendations on stocks related to the gaming and hospitality industry. So I've been doing this for 14 years with two different firms. And before that, I was involved in private equity investing with respect to the hospitality and gaming industry. And I was CFO of a gaming development company in Asia and an investment banker before that. So I've been involved in the gaming industry for 23, 24 years.
And I think it's always interesting what you have to say even at this event, that where there's so much optimism and excitement for the new Thailand casino resort, but you're also saying, listen, there's also reasons to put the brakes on a little bit, at least in regard to the thinking, because you bring up examples like Japan.
Yeah.
What are some things that you think, man, we can't overlook certain things?
Well, look, I think one of the problems that new jurisdictions often run into, governments often run into, is they try to look at a successful jurisdiction and copy it. Right? Macau being a prime example. Every jurisdiction that was looking at gaming that I've talked to in the past has always looked to Macau as kind of the benchmark. But Macau comes with a significant number of very unique advantages. Political advantages, location advantages, economic advantages that other jurisdictions don't necessarily have, right? So when you look at jurisdictions and they're looking at, let's do a gaming industry, there's various paths to follow. And the draft law, for example, calls for what will eventually be, and this isn't exactly on paper, but the rumor is that there'll be 2 casinos in Bangkok, one kind of an eastern corridor, 2 more in the north. Step back and you think about, well, does that make sense for this market, right? And the answer may be yes, but it also may be, well, maybe that's not the right way to think about it. Maybe what you actually need is, for example, more of a strip concept in or outside of Bangkok, where you create critical mass to develop a gaming industry, but it'll be solely in that location. The problem that you often run into in these jurisdictions is there are local economic competing interests, political competing interests, right? Politicians want to have, for example, an integrated resort in their neighborhood, right? So all of these things may work against creating an optimal industry structure. So when I think we look at Thailand and the progress they've made, which has been fairly rapid, there's still a lot of holes and question marks around what this industry will actually wind up looking like.
You know, you reference it, that there can be biases in selecting even a location based on somebody's own interests or based on an area's interest. So step back from all that and say, just through experience, and when you analyze Thailand as a market as objectively as you can be, but considering Thailand and its culture and whatnot, where should the casino resort be and what should the strategy be?
Well, look, I think, first off, whenever a government looks at doing a casino industry, you've got to go back to kind of first initial principles, which are, what is the objective, right? What is the government trying to achieve by initiating a discussion and then implementation of a gaming industry, right? And there's various different objectives, and some may be more important than others depending on the jurisdiction. So when I think about Thailand, what are they trying to achieve, right? Is it maximization of tax revenue for the budget? Is it maximization of local employment? Is it maximization of international tourists who are gamblers? Is it maximization of tourists who will view gaming as an amenity but come for a variety of other reasons like MICE or entertainment? All of those drivers may be important, but some are going to be more important than others. So before we talk about how many casinos, where, how much do they cost, it's important for the government to outline exactly what it is that they're trying to achieve, because that'll give developers and investors an opportunity to understand where their own strengths are, how much they're going to be willing to invest under that type of construct. Singapore did a very good job with this when they did their licensing process. They had a whole set of parameters that explained what it is the objective of the government was, and people put in bids, operators put in bids around those objectives, targeting those objectives. And that's why we have Marina Bay Sands and what it is, and Resorts World Sentosa and what that is. That was one example of a structure that worked really well. That's not to say that that's the structure Thailand should be using. Thailand needs to kind of figure it out for themselves in terms of what makes sense for their society. But that is actually critically important, and I haven't seen as much of that yet from the government in terms of identifying what are our objectives.
And Vitaly, through your experience, your years of experience, you see new markets open up, and sometimes you just have a kind of a gut feel that ends up being validated probably a lot of times. What do you feel the objectives of this strategy should be for the new Thailand casino? What would be the right objectives?
Well, look, I think the things that I mentioned are all critically important. What it boils down to is offsetting needs and wants to make an industry such that investors will come in and maximize the output such that you get the results that you want. So, for example, it's very easy to raise tax revenue. They could build smaller scale casinos all over the country, right? Not that anyone's suggesting this, but you could build 20, 30 casinos across the country, very small, very regional, don't require a lot of investment dollars. You'll have a lot of gaming positions, you'll have decent amount of employment, and you'll raise tax revenue. Now, is that what you really want in Thailand? Probably not. What you're going after is a combination of enough tax resources coming in, significant employment opportunities, which means you have to go larger scale, and then the ability to drive incremental tourism that's, I would say, different from what you already have, because that is one of the objectives. So when we talk about building a large-scale integrated resort or two in Bangkok, that makes a lot of sense. When we start talking about putting a casino in Phuket, outside of political considerations, because there needs to be political support from certain factions in building a casino in that region, I'm not sure that makes the most sense. I think you're better off doing a larger scale, more protected duopoly or small oligopoly type structure where the operators have to compete with each other, but they compete on a large scale. Number two, the locals limitation, I think, is an important factor in Thailand. They looked at Singapore, they looked at Japan, and they implemented in the law effectively limits on locals by providing for a high fee structure for a local to go in. That works in a very wealthy place like Singapore. It works in a very wealthy country like Japan. It may not work so well in Thailand. The reason why is that if you look at Singapore, for example, there is still a fairly large revenue stream day to day that comes in from the local environment, from local customers on the gaming side. You need to have locals in order to make large-scale integrated resorts thrive. What we've seen in other jurisdictions that have really tried to eliminate, for example, locals, Korea, prime example, is those properties do not work well. They can't build anything of scale. Anything they do that's large has a very difficult time achieving any kind of reasonable rate of return. But on the flip side, you have responsible gaming issues that you need to manage, and there's a fine balancing act. I think none of the jurisdictions anywhere around the world have done a great job on responsible gaming. I think Thailand has an opportunity to think this through much better, rather than just talking about, well, we're going to limit numbers of people entering, or we're going to limit how much money you have before you're able to enter a casino and you got to pay a fee to get in. What they really need to focus on is how to deal with the aftermath of the gambling problem, because you're going to have a gambling problem no matter what. If you prevent people from going to the casino in a place like Thailand, the underground gaming industry is rampant. You could drive 2.5 hours to Phuket. It's not going to limit people who you don't want gambling to gamble. What you effectively want to do in a legalized gaming structure is open the door, eliminate the illegalities, control it, regulate it, tax it, provide employment, and then use the excess resources that you have available as a government from taxation to then implement proper responsible gaming education and assistance in a way that I think will help those types of people deal with their problems.
On the responsible gaming topic, in a way, by legalizing, like you're suggesting, the casino resort, and then having programs in place to help those that need help. Right now, those, like you said, in Thailand, there is so much gambling already going on illegally, a lot of online gambling going on illegally. And there are people that with problem gambling in Thailand, but they're not getting help because of the stigma. Maybe by legalizing the casino, in fact, it extends an arm to those that do need help that currently aren't getting help.
Well, that's right. So what you do is you legalize, you make it more available, then you crack down more heavily on illegal activity to limit it. Because again, the people that are going to gamble, my view is they're going to gamble anyway. They're going to gamble. If they can't go into your legal casino, they'll go to the underground casino. They'll go online. They'll go across the border. There's plenty of other opportunities available. One of the big drivers for online gaming legalization, sports betting legalization in the United States, for example, has been to circumvent the illegal online gaming because it's very difficult to control. When you provide a legal outlet that's regulated, so you go into the casino, if you win, you're going to be able to walk out with your winnings, right? You know that it's regulated, the games aren't fixed. That's a huge draw for customers. So by creating that alternative to the illegality and then cracking down on the illegality, you're actually then able to provide services to any of those players that may necessarily, need some help. That's the way to do it. It just, again, I don't think it's been done as well as it potentially could be in many jurisdictions.
This video, the topic is reasons to be bearish on the new Thailand Casino Resort in a way, or at least things to consider out of all the optimism and excitement like we saw in Japan. And then all of a sudden there's a dose of reality. We're trying to plant the seed of reality right now, and you brought up before reasons why casino resorts don't do so well, say, in beachfront destinations.
Yep.
And now we talked about Phuket. Explain a little bit more about that.
Well, my perspective is people don't go on beach holidays to sit in a casino for 8 hours and gamble. Right, so the casinos in beach type areas are typically amenities, like a spa is, right? People may go in, have some fun in a casino, and then go out and do outdoor activities. That's why you're headed to the beach, right? So if your purpose is to build a casino for the purposes of a casino, right? You want to have a casino environment where, as a developer, you want to have a casino environment where customers come primarily for the casino. That's where your highest return of investment is, right? Now, integrated resorts, now we're talking multi-billion-dollar resorts, and that's not something I think that's really being contemplated for Chiang Mai or Phuket. Multi-billion-dollar integrated resorts that have all the other features are a different construct. But if you're going to build a casino with amenities versus amenities with a casino, if you will, it's a very different construct in terms of who the customer base is going to be. So you've got to be very, I think, cognizant of the fact that if you're trying to build casinos in locations where most of the tourists are actually there for a very different reason, your business levels are not going to be as high as they would be in a pure casino destination.
What I like about what you're saying is it's so practical and it makes it so rational. Meaning, you're right. I mean, I make my base Phuket, and when I'm there, I wouldn't want to go to a casino if I was there on holiday. I would want to be on the beach or doing beach activities. Whereas not only that, but also the infrastructure, I don't think it lends itself to a lot more traffic to go to a casino.
That's right. So if you are going to want to have a casino in a place like Phuket, you got to think through what would actually make sense. What doesn't make sense is a multi-billion-dollar project, but then is having a pure casino targeting the tourists and the locals something that you really need to have in Phuket. Outside of the fact that maybe there are some interests in Phuket that want to have that opportunity. Do you actually need to have it there? Because no matter what you do, if you build more casinos, that raises the level of competition. raising the level of competition reduces future return opportunities for other developers. So if your objective, for example, in Bangkok is to have a property eventually of scale that's competitive with, say, Singapore, right? And that's a whole different discussion. But if that is an objective, right? Having 5 other casinos all around Thailand works against that objective.
Makes sense.
Realistically. Especially in a market where there's still a lot of uncertainty around demand. Right? Any market that you're opening up that's fresh, that's brand new, there's uncertainty. Going back to Macau, when Macau first opened with initial concessions, the investment requirements were quite small for each of the concessionaires. The government didn't mandate the development of billion dollar properties. That came because developers understood that the returns were there to actually build these things. So jurisdictions that often require, I would say, outsized investment out of the box are problematic for a lot of investors because it's uncertain what the outcome is going to be.
You brought up during your presentation here about political stability as an issue.
Well, political stability is always an issue. And any investor, forgetting about which industry they're going into, if someone's coming into a jurisdiction, they want to be assured as much as possible that what they're investing into is stable. Right? And that doesn't mean that you can't have a democracy where governments change. You can. But when government changes, what you can't have is a complete repudiation of what you invested into. So if you take the developed world and democracies, governments are always changing. But the norms of business stay the same, right? Contract law stays in place, right? The regulatory environment, which is controlled by regulators, not so much politicians, stays in place. So as an investor, you have more certainty that in a democratic country, you have that stability. In places where you have a more nascent or newer form of government that has a history of having more instability, your threshold for how much you're going to invest may be lower because your risk tolerance is going to be lower.
And maybe we saw an example of this just recently as Thailand legalized cannabis. And then the new government came in, and the first thing they said is, we're going to withdraw that.
Yeah.
Now, I wonder, that's different, cannabis and casino, but it was an example of just how things quickly can sway.
Right. And I think, look, that could happen in any government, right? I mean, you could have a state government in America come in and they could say, okay, no more casinos. Hasn't really happened before because once things are in place, there's an inertia of its own. But in again, more, I would say, more volatile environments where the possibility is there, where the difference between political party A and political party B are much more extreme than you get in a more developed democracy, that is a bigger risk.
So Vitaly, as we wrap things up, let's do a quick Vitaly cheat sheet. Like, list the 3, 4, 5 things briefly that Thailand should be considering or reasons to be bearish. What are those things?
Well, look, I think, it's not about being bearish or bullish. So it's partly about kind of being realistic and understanding from an investor perspective what investors will be willing to do. I mean, what we saw, for example, in Japan was, a pretty lengthy process that everyone was expecting to move in one direction. And in the end, everybody left, right? And why'd they leave? Because the initial expectations didn't meet the reality of what actually happened. That's a danger here, right? There's a danger here in that there's expectations and some of them are being muted already. When I had this conversation at GTE, my view was we're not going to have multi-billion-dollar properties in Thailand because the government will never kind of be able to get there and persuade investors to actually put up that type of money. That's changing a little bit, but we're still kind of in that area where I think there's going to be a big reluctance to invest big dollars up front without more assurances, right? Again, Singapore, very different animal. Macau is a very different animal. But that kind of certainty around the structure, the competitive dynamic, tax, license revocation, that is a very, very important aspect that I think the government just needs to do a much stronger job on in order to convince investors that this actually makes sense for them. The one thing I want to say is, in the end, and no investor is no developer is going to say this. None of the public companies will say this. Every single one of the large companies, the gaming companies, they're in Macau, they're in Las Vegas. Every single one of them can walk away from Thailand. It's not a must-have, right? It's not. And I think partly some elements of government need to fully understand that it is a partnership arrangement and that partner can walk. They do not need to be here, right? So I think it's very, very important to make sure that you have the right levels of expertise advising the government on a lot of these parameters and working with industry to come up with a structure, a framework, a concept that actually makes sense. And then we deal with actually the licensure process and the bidding process.
It's interesting you bring that up, that you said they don't need Thailand. Sometimes Thailand might go into it thinking they want us, they need us, but in the big picture.
They don't look, is it a nice have? Absolutely. Would someone like to do a $2 billion property with a 25, 30% IRR? Absolutely. Do they need to be here? No, they didn't need to be in Japan, even though it could potentially be a great market if it actually gets developed. So in the end, developers, operators, these are all largely public companies. They all have shareholders to answer to. The primary objective is what are you going to do with your capital? Because if you don't find good investment opportunities, the capital goes back to investors and they can reallocate that capital in their own way to maximize their own returns. So if an operator looks at a market and says, you know what, like the returns just aren't there, they don't need to be there. No one needs to be here. No one really needs to be here. Any of the large-scale casino companies. Again, would they like to? Yes, absolutely, if it makes sense. But if it doesn't make sense, they'll walk away.
Let's pretend everything moves along smoothly. Did Thailand learn from the fumbles of Japan what to avoid? Say everything moves in the perfect world. How soon could this happen, the new casino, and where do you think it would happen? In Thailand?
I mean, look, I think there's already a view of where things are going to happen, right? We mentioned them, two in Bangkok, one at Eastern Corridor, et cetera. That's probably the framework, more or less, where we wind up, right? Because, again, there's political interests, there's local business interests, all of these things matter. I don't think we wind up in a situation where there's 20 casinos, and I don't think we wind up in a situation where there's one, right? So kind of that, 5-ish with two bigger ones in Bangkok is a reasonable framework under that construct. In terms of timing, look, I think the law the draft law that's in place is a skeleton, right? There's really not much there that gives anybody any kind of confidence in terms of what this industry is going to be. So just getting that law passed is going to take us into September, right, in terms of it becoming effective. The regulatory construct in terms of how it's being set up in the law is a little bit different from a lot of other jurisdictions. There's much more political influence in it than there is in other jurisdictions, which could be a positive, but also could be a big negative, because again, it creates that element of uncertainty, because not the technocrats aren't doing it, it's the politicians that are doing it, and they all have their own agendas. And then you have to figure out how are you going to run a bidding process. Like, are you actually going to have a bidding process? Are you just going to have negotiated one-off deals? Are you going to have every property with a local partner who has land available? Are you going to use government land? Like, none of that has been resolved. So it's a long ways off. And then when we talk about building, if we're talking about building an integrated resort, let's call it a $3 billion resort in Bangkok, that's a 4 to 5 year development cycle, realistically, right? The design, the development, right? Securing the land, clearing the land, infrastructure, then building into opening. We're talking probably 4 to 5 years, best case. And none of this starts until probably 2026 at the earliest.
We're really talking 2031.
I think it's 2030. I mean, some people were out saying, oh, we'll open a casino before Japan does. Maybe, because Japan's project keeps getting pushed back, right? But I think, before 2030 is probably less realistic for the larger scale. Now, could you build a $500 million casino in Phuket? Yeah, you could do that much quicker.
Yeah, so for those watching or listening to this interview, and they think they're going to come visit Thailand and go to a casino in 2028, probably not too likely.
Unlikely. Unless, again, you have one of these just small, pretty much a casino without a lot of integrated resort capabilities. That could get built fairly quickly.
But do you think there's a danger to doing that, to coming into the market with the smaller resort versus some conversation here is, no, we got to do it right and come in with the larger?
The problem is, if you say operator X can do a small casino out of the box, but operator B is going to have to build a $3 billion 4-year, 5-year development process. If I'm operator B, I may just wait to see how this property does, right? I may say, wait a minute, he's going to get a first mover advantage already. Let me see what the market actually is before I start committing resources, right? On the flip side, another alternative, which I was going to talk about this on a panel, I didn't. I'm going to talk about it on tomorrow's panel, but if you look at some places in the US and other jurisdictions, they've allowed larger scale developers to open temporary casinos before the big one opens up, okay? There are benefits to this if it's truly temporary, right? The big benefit is, number one, you start generating tax revenue day one. Casino opens in a short period of time because it's temporary in nature. You start generating tax revenue. You also start employment earlier. Most importantly, though, is you start getting the regulators to start doing their jobs, to regulate the industry and understand how the gaming industry works before the large-scale casinos open up, right? So I don't think this has really been talked about in Thailand, but I think it's something to look at because there are benefits to this. Now, the danger is you get stuck in the temporary and the big project never gets built, but there are ways to make sure that does happen, that the projects
What's
do get built.
What's the example of the temporary in the U.S.?
States in the U.S. have done it. Many states have allowed casino development and allowed the operator to build, like some places have actually literally been like a tent with casino infrastructure. Now, typically those have been shorter development cycles for the actual casino, not necessarily 4 years. But Cyprus is an example of this too, where Melco's project, City of Dreams, Mediterranean is. They were allowed to open temporary casinos. They had a casino inside a shopping mall. They had slot parlors all around Cyprus. There are significant benefits to this. Also from a developer's perspective, you start generating cash flow fairly quickly, number one. And number two is you start training up staff, developing a customer base, right? All of these are highly additive so that when you open up the final property, you're actually in a much better position than you are. But if you do that, you need to allow all the operators to do that. You can't cherry pick because you can't have one operator getting kind of competitive advantage and the other one not. That wouldn't actually work out well.
But in a lot of ways, it sounds practical, maybe.
Potentially, and there's drawbacks to it again, right? Because you really have to have that. It's a carrot, but you got to have the stick. You got to make sure that what you actually want built does get built.
Vitaly, a lot of reasons to be excited about the new Thai casino, but a lot of reasons to be not concerned, but a lot of reasons to think practically.
Yeah, practically, realistically.
Before moving forward with so much optimism that it blinds.
Yeah, the danger, again, just to wrap it up, right? The danger is that you go down the path of a lot of bullishness, a lot of excitement, and then it all dies away because you can never get your act together. Again, Japan is a prime example of this, where the opportunity was so great and the outcome is very mediocre, at least at this stage.
Yeah, G2E Singapore, so right after the pandemic, it was just full of all the Japanese excitement. A lot of players from Japan were there talking about it. And then we go back to G2E Macau recently. I don't think I saw one person from Japan.
Yeah, it was done. So that's always a danger.